A wealthy rancher watched a widow beaten each day by the town until he took her as his bride. Samuel Hart was a man who had everything that most people could dream of. His ranch stretched for miles, filled with rolling pastures, herds of cattle, and barns that looked as if they had been built by the hands of skilled craftsmen over generations. Samuel himself was known in the town for his wealth, his calm demeanor, and the quiet authority he seemed to carry wherever he went. People respected him, sometimes even feared him, though he never sought to command attention. He preferred to live his life quietly, focusing on his land and the work that came with it. Samuel believed in hard work, fairness, and doing what was right, even if it meant standing alone. Despite his wealth, Samuel had always felt a kind of emptiness. His life was comfortable, but it was also lonely. He had friends, yes, but few who truly understood the weight of his responsibilities, or the quiet longing that sometimes settled over him in the evenings when he sat on the porch of his large ranch house, watching the sun sink behind the distant hills. That was when he first noticed her, Eliza Moore. Eliza was a widow living alone in a small, weather-beaten house on the edge of the town. The house had once belonged to her husband, who had passed away several years ago, leaving her to manage the property and survive in a town that had little sympathy for those who struggled. Eliza was strong, though the years of hardship had etched lines of worry and endurance on her face. She had learned to carry herself with quiet dignity, though the town's people seemed determined to challenge that dignity at every opportunity. Samuel first saw her from his carriage as he drove through the town one morning. She was carrying a basket of vegetables she had grown in her garden, her step steady, but her expression weary. He noticed a group of men leaning against the corner of the street. They shouted at her, mocking her for no reason at all, their voices harsh and unkind. Eliza did not respond, though her hands trembled slightly as she held onto the basket. The men laughed and jeered, enjoying the small power they held over someone weaker than themselves. Samuel's hands tightened around the reins of his carriage. Something inside him stirred, a mixture of anger and sorrow. He had seen cruelty before, of course, but something about the way they treated her made his chest ache. Over the next few weeks, Samuel began to notice a pattern. Each day, it seemed, someone found a reason to belittle Eliza. Sometimes it was a shove in the market, other times it was whispered insults from behind their hands. They blamed her for misfortunes, laughed at her modest clothing, and seemed to delight in reminding her that she was alone. Samuel watched quietly, often from the shadowed corner of a street or from the comfort of his carriage. He didn't interfere at first. He thought perhaps it was not his place to step into the affairs of the townspeople, but each time he saw her struggling, something inside him shifted a little more. He began noticing the small details about her life. How she carefully repaired her old clothes by hand, how she tended her little garden with such care despite the harsh sun and the poor soil, how she would pause for a moment to look at the sky as if seeking comfort from the clouds. Samuel was struck by her resilience. She had been dealt a hard hand, yet she carried herself with a sense of grace that he admired deeply. He realized that while the town saw her as weak and alone, she was anything but weak. There was a quiet strength in her that most people failed to notice. Sometimes Samuel would leave small tokens of kindness without her knowing. A basket of fresh fruit would appear on her doorstep, or a few coins slipped under the door when he passed by. He never stayed to watch her reaction. That was not the point. He wanted her to know, in some way, that she was not completely alone. It was a silent gesture, but one that connected him to her life in a way he could not explain. Every day he looked for her in the streets, watched her interactions with the townspeople, and imagined what it must feel like to endure such constant cruelty. Each day he felt a growing responsibility, a desire to do more than just observe. Eliza, meanwhile, remained unaware of Samuel's quiet attention. She had grown accustomed to the harshness of the town. She had learned to lower her eyes when people shouted, to keep her head down when insults were thrown her way, and to carry on with her work no matter how exhausted she felt. She had been alone for so long that she had almost accepted it as normal. Yet, despite her strength, there were moments when the loneliness became unbearable. Sitting by her small kitchen window in the evenings, she would watch the sun set and feel a heaviness in her chest, a longing for companionship and understanding that seemed forever out of reach. Samuel began to think of ways to make a real difference. He considered confronting the townspeople, but he knew that rash action could backfire. He observed their patterns carefully, learning when and where the harassment was most likely to occur. He also learned about Eliza's daily routines, the times she went to the market, the way she carried water from the well, and how she maintained her home with so little help. He admired her independence, but he also felt that no one should have to face such hardships alone. One day, as Samuel rode his horse near the edge of town, he saw a particularly cruel incident. A group of young men had cornered Eliza near the market, laughing and pushing her. She stumbled but caught herself just in time, clutching her basket tightly. Samuel's heart raced. Without thinking, he rode forward, stopping just short of the crowd. His presence alone seemed to command attention. The men froze, uncertain, and then slowly stepped back, muttering under their breath. Eliza looked up at him, startled, and for the first time, Samuel noticed the fear and relief mingled in her eyes. He did not speak. He only nodded slightly and watched as she continued on her way, safe for the moment. From that day, something changed. Samuel could not turn away anymore. He found himself thinking about her constantly, wondering how he could help without humiliating her or taking away her independence. He realized that what he felt was more than pity. It was admiration, respect, and a growing affection he could hardly name. He began visiting more often, sometimes under the pretense of business in the town, sometimes simply to see her from a distance and make sure she was safe. He was careful, patient, and always respectful, never imposing himself on her life, but always looking for ways to make it a little easier. Eliza, unaware of the full extent of Samuel's observations and quiet kindnesses, continued her life with courage and determination. Yet little by little, she began to notice small changes. Tasks that had once been nearly impossible seemed slightly easier. Strangers who had once been cruel seemed hesitant, as if sensing that someone powerful watched over her. She felt a strange comfort in this, a small sense of protection that she could not fully explain. She began to believe, quietly, that perhaps there were still good people in the world, people who would see her for who she was, not just as a lonely widow to be mocked. By the end of the first season, Samuel's presence in her life, though mostly unseen, had already begun to shift the rhythm of her days. He had not yet spoken to her directly in any meaningful way, but his actions were already making a difference. And in the quiet moments, when he watched her tend to her garden or walk along the dusty streets, he felt a deep stirring of something he had not felt in years: hope. Hope not just for her, but for the possibility of connection, companionship, and a life that could be shared rather than endured alone. Samuel knew the road ahead would be difficult. Changing the opinions of the townspeople would take time. Winning the trust of a woman who had been hurt by life would take even longer. But for the first time, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond wealth or status. It was personal, human, and profoundly moving. He had seen injustice, he had felt sorrow, and now he was determined to act not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. And so, Samuel Hart continued to watch, wait, and prepare. From a distance, he became the quiet guardian of Eliza Moore, a man whose heart had finally found something worth fighting for, even if the fight itself had not yet begun. The morning air was crisp as Samuel rode his horse through the town, the sun casting long shadows across the dusty streets. For weeks, he had watched Eliza more silently, noticing every cruel word, every shove, and every insult thrown at her. Each time he had felt a growing unease that he could no longer ignore. Today he had decided he would act, not with anger but with authority, calm and deliberate, the way a man used to commanding respect should act. Eliza, meanwhile, had begun her daily routine, unaware that Samuel was already nearby. She carried a small basket filled with eggs from the few chickens she kept, walking carefully to the market. The streets were already busy, townspeople moving about with their own business, exchanging gossip, trading goods, and casting occasional, curious glances at the widow who lived alone. Some smiled politely, some whispered, but a few, especially the group of young men who had taken pleasure in tormenting her, lingered to find amusement in her struggle. As Eliza passed the market square, the group stepped forward, blocking her path. "Careful there, widow," one sneered, bumping her shoulder just enough to make her stumble. She steadied herself quickly, but her heart pounded and the basket wobbled in her hands. The men laughed, loud and cruel, enjoying the power they had over someone so vulnerable. "Don't drop anything, or it'll be your fault," another said, pushing the basket slightly. Her face flushed, not with embarrassment alone, but with frustration and sadness she had felt far too many times before. Samuel, watching from across the street, felt a surge of determination. Without hesitation, he moved forward. His horse's hooves clattered on the stones, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. The men froze for a moment, uncertain, as the large figure of Samuel Hart approached. His expression was calm, but his presence was commanding. "Step aside," he said, his voice firm and steady. There was no question, no threat, only an unmistakable authority that could not be ignored. The young men glanced at each other, sizing up the wealthy rancher who had often been seen in town but rarely interacted directly. Slowly, reluctantly, they moved aside, muttering under their breath. Eliza looked up, her eyes wide with surprise, and for the first time she felt the strange warmth of relief. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly as Samuel nodded once, silently indicating that she was safe. He did not speak further. He simply rode past the group and walked beside her, matching her pace as they moved toward the edge of the market. Eliza felt a mixture of emotions. Gratitude, yes, but also a cautious curiosity. Who was this man who had stepped in so decisively, and why had he done so? She did not ask, unsure if she even wanted to draw attention to herself. But she could not deny the comfort that came from knowing someone strong, someone respected, was looking out for her. Over the next few days, Samuel continued his quiet acts of protection. He would be nearby during market hours, always close enough to intervene if needed, yet distant enough not to draw attention to himself. He left small gifts for her as well. Fresh bread from the bakery he frequented, a jar of honey, a bundle of cloth for her worn clothes. Always he left them discreetly, knowing that Eliza valued her independence and would not appreciate charity delivered with fanfare. Eliza began to notice these gestures, though she did not know their source. She would find a fresh loaf of bread on her doorstep or a few coins tucked under the mat, and she felt a growing sense of curiosity. Who was this kind stranger who seemed to care enough to help, yet not enough to intrude? She could not see Samuel in these moments, but she felt his presence in a way she could not explain, like a gentle shadow, protective and steady. One afternoon, while Eliza was repairing a broken fence near her garden, Samuel approached openly for the first time. He carried a bundle of wood, his hands strong and capable. "Good afternoon, Miss Moore," he said politely, tipping his hat. Eliza froze, startled, and instinctively tightened her grip on the hammer she had been using. "Mr. Hart," she replied, her voice cautious. She had heard of him, of course, the wealthy rancher who owned more land than anyone else in the county, but she had never spoken to him before. Samuel smiled gently. "I thought I could help you with this fence," he said, laying the wood down beside her. It looked like it could use a few repairs. Eliza hesitated. She was proud of her independence and had always managed her home and property alone. But something in Samuel's calm, respectful manner encouraged her to accept the help. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes meeting his for the first time. There was no arrogance in his gaze, no hint of condescension, only kindness. As they worked together, Samuel noticed the care and skill with which Eliza handled every task. She measured carefully, planned each cut, and carried each board with precision. It was clear she had been managing on her own for a long time, and he admired her resilience. "You've done well maintaining this property," he said. "Most people would have given up long ago." Eliza glanced at him, a mixture of surprise and modesty in her expression. "I do what I must," she replied simply. "It's not always easy, but it keeps me going." Their conversation grew naturally as they worked, moving from practical matters to small stories of the town, and eventually to personal reflections. Samuel spoke of life on his ranch, the early mornings and long hours, the pride he felt in his work, and the loneliness that sometimes accompanied it. Eliza listened, intrigued by the glimpse into a life so different from her own, yet marked by challenges and responsibilities she could understand. She spoke as well, carefully at first, about her late husband, the struggles she had faced alone, and the ways she had learned to survive in a town that often seemed cruel. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the fields, Samuel and Eliza stood back to admire the repaired fence. It was sturdy, straight, and functional, just like the quiet bond that had begun to form between them. Eliza felt an unfamiliar sense of comfort, a sense that someone understood her, someone cared for her not out of pity but out of genuine respect. Samuel felt it too, a connection that went beyond the simple acts of help, beyond the casual conversations. There was an understanding, a recognition of shared humanity that neither had expected to find. The days that followed brought more of these quiet interactions. Samuel would help with errands, offer assistance with chores, and sometimes simply spend time nearby, talking about the land, the animals, or the weather. Each encounter built trust, and slowly, Eliza began to lower the walls she had built around her heart. She started to look forward to these moments, feeling a sense of hope and companionship that had been absent for many years. Samuel, for his part, was careful not to overwhelm her. He respected her space, her independence, and her pride. Every action he took was deliberate, measured, and thoughtful. He understood that trust had to be earned, and that true kindness was shown through consistent, patient support rather than grand gestures. He admired her strength, her determination, and the quiet dignity with which she faced life's hardships. And though he had not yet spoken of his feelings, he felt them growing stronger with each passing day, a mix of admiration, affection, and a desire to protect and support her in every way he could. Meanwhile, the townspeople began to notice the subtle change in Eliza's life. The harassment became less frequent, not because the cruelty had disappeared, but because Samuel's presence, though often unseen, made them hesitant. They had learned to respect him, to fear the consequences of crossing a man who had influence and standing in the town. Eliza, sensing the difference, felt a small relief, a quiet reassurance that someone was watching over her, someone who cared enough to intervene when necessary. By the end of the second part of this story, Samuel and Eliza had formed a bond that was invisible to most of the town, but powerful in its quiet strength. They had not yet spoken of love or companionship, but they had found something equally important: trust, respect, and the knowledge that neither had to face life entirely alone. Samuel had become not just a silent observer, but a guardian, a friend, and a presence in her life that would grow increasingly important in the days to come. And so life continued, with its small joys, quiet struggles, and the slow, steady unfolding of a connection that neither Samuel nor Eliza had anticipated, but both would come to cherish. The stage was set for the moments that would follow, moments of courage, of kindness, and of a bond that would ultimately change their lives forever. The days grew warmer, and the sunlight stretched lazily over the town as Samuel Hart continued his quiet watch over Eliza Moore. Their relationship, though still delicate and tentative, had begun to take on a life of its own. They had shared small conversations, laughter over minor mishaps, and the silent understanding that grew from observing someone else's struggles and triumphs. Samuel found himself thinking about her more often than he expected, and he realized that the feeling was no longer simply concern or admiration. It had grown into something deeper, something that made his chest tighten with every thought of her. Eliza, meanwhile, had started to notice the presence of the man who had intervened on her behalf. At first, she had been wary, unsure of why a wealthy rancher would be interested in someone like her. Yet over time she began to see the kindness in his actions, the respect he showed her, and the consistency of his support. There was no rush, no pressure, only a steady and quiet presence that made her feel safer and slowly more open to trust. One afternoon, Samuel visited Eliza under the pretense of delivering supplies. She had asked for a few things from the general store: flour, sugar, and some thread for repairs, and he had offered to bring them himself. When he arrived, he found her sitting outside her house, patching a worn dress. "Good afternoon, Miss Moore," he said with his usual calm politeness. She looked up, startled but pleased. "Mr. Hart," she replied softly, smiling faintly. The warmth in her voice made his heart lift. As they sorted the items together, their conversation grew personal, though never intrusive. Samuel spoke of the ranch, the early mornings, and the quiet satisfaction that came from hard work. Eliza spoke of her late husband, her small garden, and the challenges of maintaining her home alone. She spoke cautiously, revealing pieces of herself in measured amounts, testing the waters to see if he would truly listen. And he did. He listened with patience, with attention, and with a respect that made her feel seen in a way the townspeople had never allowed. Over the weeks, these visits became more frequent. Samuel would come by under various pretexts, checking on supplies, delivering items, or simply walking near her property. He began to help with tasks that were difficult for her alone. He mended the roof that leaked during storms, repaired broken fences, and carried heavy loads of wood and water. Every action was performed with care and consideration, never condescending, never demanding gratitude. Eliza watched him work, sometimes assisting, sometimes simply observing, and she began to feel a sense of partnership that she had not experienced in years. It was during one of these afternoons that something subtle but significant occurred. Samuel noticed how hard Eliza worked, how she measured every step, every movement, to avoid fatigue or injury. He saw the determination in her eyes, the pride in her careful work, and he realized that this woman, though vulnerable in the eyes of the town, was one of the strongest people he had ever met. "You've been handling everything on your own for quite some time," he said quietly, as he carried a heavy basket of water to the garden. She glanced at him, a hint of surprise in her expression. "I have too," she replied simply. "Life doesn't wait for anyone, and it certainly doesn't wait for a widow." Samuel nodded, impressed by her resilience. "But that doesn't mean you should bear it all alone," he said gently. "There's no shame in letting someone help." She looked down, considering his words. It was true she had spent so long doing everything herself that the idea of depending on someone else felt foreign. Yet, something about Samuel's steady presence made her willing to accept that help, if only a little at a time. As they worked together in the garden, they began sharing more than just tasks. Samuel learned about her favorite flowers, the stories behind the recipes she cooked, and the memories she cherished from her life with her late husband. Eliza, in turn, learned about Samuel's childhood, the responsibilities he had taken on early in life, and the loneliness that came with wealth and influence. They discovered a shared understanding of the burdens life could place on a person and the ways people learned to endure them. One afternoon, while they rested under the shade of a large oak tree, Samuel spoke more openly than he had before. "Miss Moore," he began carefully, "I've spent a lot of time thinking about what's fair and what's right, and I believe no one should have to face life's hardships alone, especially not someone as strong as you." Eliza looked at him, her eyes softening. She felt a warmth she had not allowed herself to feel in many years. "Thank you, Mr. Hart," she said quietly. "It means a lot to hear that." Their bond grew with each passing day. They laughed together over small mistakes in the garden, shared stories about animals on the ranch and birds in the yard, and sometimes simply sat in silence, enjoying the comfort of each other's presence. The town, which had once seen Eliza as weak and alone, began to notice the subtle changes. People whispered as they passed by, curious about the widow who now seemed more confident and less burdened by the cruelty of others. The harassments that had once been daily occurrences became less frequent, not because the cruelty had disappeared, but because Samuel's quiet authority discouraged it. Despite the progress, there were still moments of tension. Some townspeople were envious of Samuel's attention to Eliza, and a few whispered that she was taking advantage of his wealth. Others simply could not understand why a man of his status would care for someone like her. But Samuel did not waver. He continued to show his support through actions, not words, and his consistency slowly silenced critics and earned respect. One evening, as they worked together to repair a section of the fence damaged by a recent storm, Samuel paused and watched Eliza struggle with a particularly heavy post. Without a word, he stepped forward and lifted it alongside her, their hands brushing slightly. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of mutual respect, trust, and a growing connection that neither had yet named. Eliza felt a flutter of warmth she had not felt in years, and Samuel felt a surge of protectiveness and admiration that went beyond mere kindness. As the weeks turned into months, their relationship continued to deepen. Samuel's interventions were no longer occasional. They became a natural part of daily life. He would arrive with supplies, help with chores, or simply spend time talking and sharing experiences. Eliza began to rely on him in ways she had never relied on anyone, yet she did so without feeling diminished or dependent. Samuel, in turn, found that the presence of Eliza brought a joy and meaning to his life that wealth and success alone could never provide. One rainy afternoon, Samuel and Eliza found themselves huddled under the eaves of her house, watching the downpour. The sound of the rain on the roof was soothing, and for a moment neither spoke. Then Eliza, in a quiet voice, said, "It's strange, isn't it? How life can be so hard, and yet moments like this make it feel worth it." Samuel smiled softly. "Yes," he replied, "and it's moments like this that remind me why we endure the hardships, to find connection, to find someone to share it with." Eliza looked at him, a mixture of curiosity and understanding in her eyes. "And do you think some people are meant to find each other?" she asked softly. Samuel's gaze met hers, steady and unwavering. "I do," he said. "I believe that when two people truly understand each other, they can face anything together." It was a quiet revelation, a moment of shared understanding that neither had anticipated but both felt deeply. Their bond was no longer merely about protection or kindness. It had grown into something richer, more complex, and profoundly human. They had found in each other a companion, a friend, and perhaps, though neither yet admitted it aloud, the beginnings of love. By the end of this part of their story, Samuel and Eliza had moved beyond simple gestures of help. They had built a foundation of trust, respect, and emotional intimacy that would carry them through the challenges ahead. The town, once cruel and unyielding, had begun to soften in subtle ways, but the true transformation was happening in their hearts. They were learning to rely on one another, to share burdens and joys alike, and to find in each other a quiet strength that neither had known they needed. And so life continued, with its small triumphs, quiet struggles, and the steady growth of a bond that promised to change both their lives forever. Samuel had moved from being a silent observer to a confidant, a protector, and a source of hope for Eliza. And Eliza, in turn, had begun to open her heart, allowing herself to trust, to feel, and to hope again. The stage was now set for the moments that would follow, moments of courage, of revelation, and of a connection that neither Samuel nor Eliza could have imagined at the beginning of their story. The town had begun to notice changes in Eliza more. She walked taller, her movements more confident, and there was a quiet glow about her that had not been there before. Yet, despite the small shifts in how the townspeople treated her, there were still moments of cruelty. Some people could not let go of their old habits, and they continued to whisper behind her back, or try to embarrass her in subtle ways. For Samuel Hart, each incident was a test of patience and judgment. He had grown protective of Eliza, not in a controlling way, but with a deep care that compelled him to act whenever she was treated unfairly. It was a bright morning when a serious incident occurred, one that would change everything between Samuel, Eliza, and the townspeople. Eliza had gone into town to purchase some basic supplies. She carried her basket carefully, moving between the stalls with quiet determination. Samuel, as usual, followed at a distance, observing. He noticed a small group of townspeople gathered near the center of the market. Their expressions were sharp, their whispers sharp enough for him to catch fragments of cruel remarks aimed at her. As Eliza passed by, one of the men stepped in front of her, deliberately bumping her shoulder. "Careful there, widow," he sneered. She stumbled slightly but held onto her basket, not responding. Another man laughed and said, "Watch your step, or you'll drop your goods just like your husband dropped you." The words were cruel, meant to wound, and Samuel's chest tightened with anger. He had been patient for weeks, but this moment demanded action. Without hesitation, Samuel stepped forward. His long strides carried him into the center of the market square. He was calm, but there was an authority in his stance and tone that made everyone stop and take notice. "Enough," he said firmly, his voice carrying across the square. "Leave her alone." There was no argument, no plea, just quiet, undeniable command. The men froze, realizing that the wealthy rancher who had long been respected and sometimes feared was speaking. Slowly, reluctantly, they stepped back, muttering under their breath. Eliza turned to look at Samuel, surprise and relief in her eyes. She had grown accustomed to his presence from a distance, but this was the first time she truly felt protected in a public moment. Her heart swelled with gratitude, though she was too shy to speak immediately. Samuel, sensing her tension, offered a small nod and a reassuring smile. "You're safe," he said quietly. That simple sentence carried more weight than any long speech could have. After the incident, Samuel walked beside her as they moved away from the market. He was careful not to overstep, allowing her space while providing silent support. "I wish I could protect you from all of it," he said softly. Eliza shook her head, a small smile touching her lips. "I know you can't," she replied, "but it feels good to know someone cares." That simple acknowledgement deepened their bond in ways words could hardly capture. Over the next few weeks, Samuel's presence in her life became even more natural. He would help with chores, deliver supplies, and spend time talking with her about the land, the animals, and their shared experiences. Their conversations grew more personal, touching on dreams, fears, and memories. Samuel discovered that Eliza had a sharp mind, a compassionate heart, and a resilience that inspired him. She, in turn, learned about his loneliness despite his wealth, his hopes for companionship, and the quiet joy he found in simple moments on his ranch. One evening, as they were repairing a section of the barn roof damaged by a recent storm, Samuel noticed how careful Eliza was with every movement. He saw the determination in her eyes and the quiet pride in her work. "You've endured so much," he said, his voice gentle. "And yet here you are still standing strong." Eliza looked at him, her eyes softening. "Life hasn't been easy," she admitted, "but I've learned that giving up is not an option, and sometimes the little kindnesses along the way make all the difference." Samuel reached out and adjusted a loose beam, his hands brushing her slightly. The contact was brief, but it sent a subtle warmth through both of them. They exchanged a glance that spoke volumes, an unspoken understanding of trust, care, and the bond that had quietly grown between them. For Eliza, it was a revelation to feel safe and seen. For Samuel, it was a realization that his feelings had evolved beyond simple admiration into a deeper affection he could no longer ignore. The townspeople, meanwhile, continued to watch the interactions with curiosity and unease. Samuel's quiet interventions had earned him respect, but some still murmured, questioning why he devoted so much attention to a widow. "Why does he care so much for her?" they whispered. "She's nothing more than a simple woman." Yet, despite their gossip, the harassment that had once been relentless began to fade. People were wary of provoking Samuel, and slowly, the town started to acknowledge the change in Eliza's presence, her confidence, her calm, and the subtle strength that Samuel's protection had helped nurture. One afternoon, while they were walking along a path near her home, Samuel spoke more openly about his thoughts and feelings. "Miss Moore," he began, choosing his words carefully, "I've watched you for some time now. Not just the struggles, but also your strength, your determination, and your courage. You have endured more than most could imagine, and yet you continue forward. That is something rare, something to admire deeply." Eliza looked at him, a mix of surprise, humility, and emotion in her expression. "I never thought anyone would notice," she admitted softly. Samuel shook his head. "It's impossible not to notice someone like you," he said sincerely, "and it's impossible not to care." The honesty in his words struck her. For the first time in years, she felt truly recognized, not for her hardships alone, but for the person she was, the strength she carried, and the kindness she held despite the world's cruelty. She felt a warmth that made her chest tighten and her eyes glisten. Their bond deepened with these shared moments of trust and understanding. They laughed together over small mistakes, shared memories of happier times, and discussed their hopes for the future. Samuel began to see her not just as someone to protect, but as a companion he wanted in his life in a far more personal and profound way. Eliza, in turn, began to realize that Samuel's presence brought comfort, stability, and an unexpected joy she had not felt in years. It was during another particularly difficult day that Samuel's role as protector became undeniable. A group of townspeople had gathered near her property, intending to intimidate her over a misunderstanding. Eliza was prepared to face them, as she always had, with quiet dignity. But Samuel stepped forward without hesitation, confronting the group calmly but firmly. His words carried authority and clarity. "This ends now," he said. "You will not harm her, insult her, or belittle her again. Understand that there will be consequences if you do." The group hesitated, unsure of how to respond to a man of such stature, power, and calm confidence. Slowly, they dispersed, muttering but ultimately respecting the unspoken warning. Eliza watched Samuel handle the situation with a mix of awe and gratitude. She realized that she was not just being helped, she was being protected by someone who valued her safety, her dignity, and her life. The moment cemented her trust in him, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel that she could rely on him without fear of judgment or disappointment. That evening, as they sat together on the porch of her house, the events of the day lingering in their minds, Samuel spoke gently. "You've shown incredible strength, Eliza, but even the strongest people need support sometimes. I hope you'll allow me to be that support for you." Eliza looked at him, a quiet smile forming on her lips. "I think I already have," she whispered. The words were simple, but they carried a depth of meaning that both understood. By the end of this period in their lives, Samuel and Eliza had moved from cautious friendship to a bond defined by trust, respect, and shared experience. They had faced moments of public scrutiny, cruelty, and hardship, and they had emerged with a connection that was stronger than either had expected. Samuel had become more than a protector. He was a companion, a confidant, and a presence in her life that brought hope, safety, and the beginnings of love. Eliza, in turn, had opened her heart, allowing herself to feel supported, valued, and understood in ways she had thought impossible. The stage was now set for the next chapter of their story, one in which trust would deepen, emotions would be revealed, and the possibility of a life shared together would begin to take shape. Samuel and Eliza were no longer two people living parallel lives. They were connected, their paths intertwined by acts of kindness, courage, and quiet devotion. And though challenges still lay ahead, they faced them together, stronger for the bond they had built, and ready for the transformations that love, trust, and shared purpose could bring. The seasons had changed, and with each passing day, the bond between Samuel Hart and Eliza Moore had grown stronger. The small town had begun to recognize the transformation in Eliza, though they still whispered and speculated. Yet their opinions mattered less and less, because Samuel and Eliza had discovered something far more important than the judgments of others: a quiet, mutual understanding, trust, and a growing love that neither had expected to find. It was on a bright, late spring morning that Samuel decided he could no longer wait to speak openly about his feelings. He had watched Eliza work tirelessly, manage her home, and handle the challenges of her life with strength and grace. He had seen her kindness to animals, her thoughtfulness toward neighbors, and the dignity with which she faced the cruelty of the town. And he knew, with a certainty that surprised even him, that he wanted her to be part of his life, not just as someone he protected, but as someone he shared his life with completely. Eliza, for her part, had come to rely on Samuel's presence as much as she had once feared to rely on anyone. She had grown comfortable sharing her thoughts, her memories, and her fears with him. She had felt his protection, his support, and his respect for her independence. And somewhere along the way, she realized that her heart felt lighter, warmer, and more alive whenever he was near. She had begun to see him not only as a friend, but as a companion she could trust and care for deeply. Samuel approached her house that morning with a sense of determination and gentle anticipation. In his hands, he carried a small bundle of wildflowers he had picked from his ranch, simple, yet chosen with care, a symbol of both admiration and affection. Eliza was in the garden, tending to the flowers she had planted herself, when she noticed him approaching. She smiled softly, a familiar warmth spreading through her chest. "Good morning, Mr. Hart," she said, her voice light but tinged with curiosity. "Good morning, Eliza," Samuel replied, returning her smile. He handed her the bundle of wildflowers. "For you," he said simply. "I thought you might enjoy them." She took the flowers, her fingers brushing his, and felt a small shiver of recognition, not of fear, but of the bond that had grown between them. "They're beautiful," she said softly, looking into his eyes. There was a pause, a quiet moment filled with unspoken words, as the world seemed to narrow down to the two of them standing in the garden. Samuel took a deep breath, his heart beating faster than he expected. "Eliza," he began, his voice steady but gentle, "I have watched you for a long time. I have seen your strength, your courage, and the kindness you show even when the world is harsh. And I have come to realize something important. I care for you more than I ever imagined possible. I care for you not because you need protection, but because of who you are. I care for you because I want to share my life with you if you'll allow me." Eliza's eyes widened, a mixture of surprise, emotion, and something deeper that she had not yet named. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the flowers. "Mr. Hart," she whispered, her voice barely audible, I don't know what to say." Samuel took a careful step closer, his gaze soft and unwavering. "You don't need to say anything yet," he replied gently. "Just know that my feelings are sincere, and I hope that you might feel the same." For a long moment, Eliza simply looked at him, her mind and heart racing. She thought of the weeks and months they had spent together, the quiet conversations, the shared laughter, the moments of trust and understanding. She thought of the strength she had found in herself and the support she had found in him. And slowly a smile began to form on her lips, a smile that carried a mixture of relief, joy, and acceptance. "Samuel," she said softly, using his first name for the first time, "I think I feel the same." Hearing those words, Samuel felt a wave of happiness and relief. It was not a dramatic confession, nor a moment of grand gestures. It was simple, sincere, and true. The quiet joy of mutual understanding filled the space between them, stronger than any words could convey. They stood together in the garden, the sunlight warming their faces, the air filled with the scent of flowers, and a sense of peace settled over them. In the following days, they began to talk openly about what the future might hold. Samuel invited Eliza to visit the ranch more often, to see the fields, the barns, and the animals he had cared for all his life. He wanted her to feel at home, to see that their lives could be intertwined not just in the town, but in the open spaces where he had spent his days. Eliza, cautious yet eager, accepted, and found herself enchanted by the vastness of the ranch, the rhythm of daily work, and the quiet companionship that Samuel offered without ever demanding anything in return. The town continued to watch, their curiosity and gossip gradually giving way to respect. They could see the change in Eliza, her confidence, her happiness, and the way she carried herself with newfound grace. They could see Samuel's dedication, the care in his actions, and the sincerity in his eyes. Slowly, the whispers of doubt and envy faded, replaced by a quiet acknowledgement that something good had come from their unlikely bond. One afternoon, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting golden light over the fields, Samuel took Eliza's hand in his. "I would like us to be more than friends," he said softly, "to share our lives, our joys, and our challenges together. Will you marry me?" Eliza felt her heart leap, a mixture of surprise, joy, and deep affection. She had never imagined that her life, once so lonely and filled with hardship, could hold this kind of happiness. With a quiet smile and tears of joy glistening in her eyes, she nodded. "Yes, Samuel, I will." The wedding was simple, held at the edge of Samuel's ranch with only a few close friends and neighbors in attendance. It was not a grand event, but it was filled with love, laughter, and heartfelt emotion. Eliza wore a modest dress, her eyes shining with happiness. Samuel looked at her with admiration and love, knowing that she had chosen him not out of obligation, but out of trust and affection. Their vows were sincere, reflecting not only their feelings for each other, but the journey that had brought them together, the hardships, the support, and the deep understanding that had grown between them. Life on the ranch brought a new rhythm to their days. They worked side by side, caring for the land, the animals, and each other. Samuel found joy in sharing his world with Eliza, showing her the beauty of the rolling pastures, the sunrise over the hills, and the quiet peace of the ranch life. Eliza, in turn, brought warmth, kindness, and an understanding heart to the ranch, helping Samuel see the value in small joys, shared laughter, and companionship. Together, they built a life filled with trust, respect, and love, each day strengthening the bond that had begun with quiet gestures, shared challenges, and unwavering support. The townspeople gradually came to accept their union. They could see that Samuel and Eliza's relationship was built on mutual respect, understanding, and genuine affection. The cruel behavior that had once targeted Eliza vanished, replaced by cautious respect and even admiration for the pair. Some of the town's younger residents who had once mocked and teased began to learn from their example that kindness, patience, and courage could bring change, and that cruelty was never worth the effort. Samuel and Eliza's love continued to grow, quietly and steadily. They learned from each other, supported each other, and celebrated the small victories of daily life. Their bond was not built on grand gestures alone, but on the accumulation of shared experiences, thoughtful acts of care, and the deep trust that comes from truly knowing someone. They had faced hardship, cruelty, and uncertainty, yet together they had found a life filled with joy, peace, and love. In the end, their story was not just about two people finding each other. It was about resilience, hope, and the quiet power of kindness. Samuel had moved from a distant observer to a protector, confidant, and loving partner. Eliza had moved from fear and isolation to trust, companionship, and a happiness she had once thought impossible. Together, they had created a life that honored their strength, their compassion, and the deep connection that had brought them together. And so, under the vast skies of the ranch, surrounded by rolling fields, the laughter of shared days, and the quiet contentment of a life built together, Samuel and Eliza began their journey as husband and wife. Their hearts were full, their bond unbreakable, and their love a testament to the power of patience, understanding, and the courage to open one's heart, even after years of hardship and solitude.